Hello, everyone, and welcome yet again to the Soft Skills Salon, an audible think tank on soft skills. I remain your host, Diana Kowarski. Hello, hello, hello. In our episode today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Renée Walkom, who is the Chief Operating Officer at a place that's overwhelming me. I can't even begin to tell you. So, Renée, welcome. Chief Operating Officer at leading North American Insurtech Foxquilt. Having joined the company in early 2021, in her current role, Renée is responsible for overseeing the design and execution of the overall corporate strategy with a keen focus on operational excellence and profitable growth. With over 15 years professional and leadership experience across Canada, the US, and Germany, Renée has specialized in global project and portfolio management, business operations, program design and implementation, and change management initiatives. Prior to joining Foxquilt, she was the head of portfolio management at Munich Re Specialty Insurance and Digital Partners, focusing on launching key insurance technology businesses across North America, bridging the gap between innovation, technology, and insurance within the ever-evolving digital MGA market. I have also, in full transparency, been very flattered that Renée has considered to join us, as she and I have resurrected perhaps a connection that's at least 15, I think we're verging on 20 years ago when we were working together. So, hello, welcome, Renée.
Hi, thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
And thanks for going through the process of selecting from that questionnaire. The first question that we're going to spend some time chatting about is a rather macro level one, and I'm delighted that that's what you've chosen as our starting point. It reads, how do you compare pre-COVID soft skills to what we've called moving beyond COVID soft skills at work? And please know before you answer, if those two categories are not as accurate, it was remarkably difficult to try and name this era, and I've yet to pinpoint one that I'm, as a name, fully satisfied with. But nonetheless, before and where we are now.
Yeah. I think the biggest change, even in the categorization, is kind of pre-hybrid workplace as a standard and post-hybrid workplace as a standard. To me, that's kind of the biggest difference we've noticed. And I'm pro-hybrid work environment from a personal and professional space, but it is different. There's no doubt about it. It is different when you're not seeing your colleagues, your teams, your bosses every day in person. And I think the biggest difference I've noticed is the difficulty in building rapport such that you have and you give the benefit of the doubt. When you see your teams in person all the time, you get a chance to joke and get to know each other and learn about people personally. And then when things get tough or heated or there's a lot of conflict potentially in the workplace, you give someone the benefit of the doubt. And everyone needs that to succeed. And that, when it's only hybrid, or in true COVID times when it wasn't even hybrid, you were just at home behind your desk, that's harder to come by. And so that's one of the biggest differences I've noticed.
That's a remarkably interesting way in terms of our previous guests, because what we've had in conversations on the podcast have been more of how that difficulty in establishing rapport relates specifically to the word trust. So the turn of phrase, the benefit of the doubt, I believe, in my understanding, is certainly in alignment with building trust, and maybe it's before or after, maybe the result or maybe a prerequisite, I don't know. But I really want to unpack that, because if the benefit of the doubt is needed to succeed, then my understanding would be that we need more information about each other and a variety of touch points in order to have that space, because we have information about each other, to have the benefit of the doubt. Does that all in alignment for you?
I think so. And I would definitely call it a facet of trust, for sure. I think trust almost goes beyond where when you're in a hybrid work environment, you need to trust your teams to be kind of doing what they're supposed to do at all times. You're no longer observing people all the time. And that I think was a difficult transition for managers. And I think the benefit of the doubt comes, it comes into play when talking about interpersonal kind of team relationships.
Yeah.
And knowing that things aren't always perfect, things aren't always 100% focused between 9 to 5. There's curveballs all the time, personal and professional. And when you know someone and you like someone and you trust that their interest when it comes to work is the best case for the workplace, then you know where they're coming from. And I think it just avoids conflict. It avoids distractions, keeps people focused on the team mentality, and the ultimate goal.
There's so much to be said for the necessity of our colleagues being well-intentioned, being a normalized, and I would say to you, maybe even celebrated point of reference. Because if we are certain that someone is well-intentioned towards themselves, towards the team, towards others, towards the work, towards, I would even be more macro about the brand of the organization, towards the reputation of a particular interaction, it could go on and on and on. If we have that certainty, then to go back to that benefit of the doubt, they go hand in hand because there's a sense that we're on the same side. And one of the other pieces in terms of, pre-COVID to our current times in this hybrid work world that I like to bring up in conversations because it's still unreconciled is that source of information that we previously had about each other. We're no longer observing each other passively, or those serendipitous bumping into each other against the, literal or the proverbial water cooler, that there, to my experience, there is no successful swap out. And that for a while, people, certainly some perhaps under-sophisticated leaders, were looking to replace those serendipitous or informal conversations with an equivalent in a hybrid team or a geographically dispersed group. And I am not certain that that equation is
Yeah,
actually real. Does that?
it's such a good point. And it's something that comes up frequently in terms of like how to build culture. And I do think for a long time, people and leaders were stuck in that one for one mentality. How do we capture that water cooler moment or that like happy hour moment when people can socialize? And that for a while in COVID, there was an attempt to do kind of the happy hour Zoom calls. And there's a lot of benefit to that. It is what it is. We had to find some way to interact, but I think the reality is it's not a one for one. People needed to start thinking outside the box a little bit, and the companies that were, I would say, more digitally focused or digitally enabled had an advantage because immediately they could flip to Zoom video, for example. Whereas before everything was on the phone. If you were in the office, it was a phone call, and then the companies you could immediately flip to video. You had that element. And then also some sort of technological integration to chat. So we use Slack, for example, and we use it very conversationally. So I feel like I'm in the office half the time because our company culture is to use it conversationally. And I think that allowed us to adapt.
There's a lot of opportunity with some of the clients that I've worked with of late to recognize that there needs to be some clear understanding within that cultural realm, which is already murky and permeable and difficult to define for most of us pre-COVID or now, that there's a hierarchy of expectation in terms of using some technologies. So I find that the clients that we work with where there's an understanding of normalized expectation around turnaround and or urgency and or formality or conversational or use in general of X means of getting in touch. So Slack, for example, versus an MS Teams message versus an email versus a voicemail, that if there is some sort of hierarchy of known expectations around turnaround in particular, that we start to chip away at some of that rapport, because it isn't a swap out. You're absolutely right. And I really hope leaders have abandoned that by now, although I think certainly some of us are at least in the news, white knuckling their hold on trying to swap it out. But do you find that there's value in some sort of hierarchy of expectation like that in the use of technology?
Yeah, and I think I almost take it for granted how naturally Fox Quilt fell into it. In that we never had to formalize anything. It just was what it was. So we're a small company. Our two co-founders kind of set the stage, so to speak, and it permeated throughout the company. I think because we're small and kind of pre-pandemic or pandemic times, very startup phase, it did come very naturally. Now, before that, I obviously worked for Munich Re, much larger institution, with its own set of challenges is trying to adapt to that. You had to be more formal with how you rolled out technology and its usage, and informal chat options was not kind of forefront of mind per se. So I kind of saw it. I jumped ship just after the pandemic changed organization. So I kind of saw massive organization to tiny one, and it was very different.
Yeah, absolutely. That must have been a real scope and scale transition for you, or a real scope and scale transition. So the next question, if we may move on, is one that's very popular amongst our guests and equally popular amongst our listeners. And it is, where have you seen or experienced empathy in your career?
This is I can see why it's a popular one, because this one really makes you think. And it made me reflect, to be honest. So over the course of my career, I definitely used to be in the camp of it's just business, right? I was kind of in that leadership habit, honestly, reflecting, very naive, and in some cases, I would say immature. But it's just black and white thinking, it's just business. The business has to do what the business has to do. And of course, there's some truth to that. A business and its leaders have to answer to the shareholders. They have to make the best decision for the shareholders in terms of fiscal responsibility and all of that. But it's not just business. People are people. They have lives. They have feelings. They have their own ecosystem of which work is a part. And I think as I've matured in my career, experiencing a different viewpoint and all of that has been very beneficial. And I've had the benefit of learning from other leaders around me and how they treat people in times of difficulty. And so where I've seen it most is for someone struggling personally, right? Of course, that impacts your work. You can't just shut that off between 9 and 5 and perform at 100%. That's not an option. At the same time, work needs work to get done. So how do you handle that? And I did have the benefit of some amazing leaders and seeing how they could appropriately manage those expectations with empathy and have the end result be amazing. Have the employee kind of get through their hard times, fully dedicated to the organization because there was that trust and that give and take there. And it just opened my eyes. I've seen it a few times, and it's changed the way I think about the ecosystem as well.
There's a lot to be said for that approach that you mentioned, and business being business, or almost a flipping of a switch, right? This is not personal, this is professional, and all those other cliches that are thrown about. And yet, it thematically, I think we're going back to some of your observations in your previous answer, because in order to display empathy in those exceptional times, as you pointed out, when life happens, right? I know I'm desperately trying to have one myself, and there's ups and downs and stuff, all the technical stuff that happens in one's life. But in order to empathize, similar to your previous answer, we still need information. And I'm reminded in your answer about the additional cliche of an open door policy, which I put in big air quotes, even for our listeners, big air quotes on open door policy, which is even more nonsensical than it ever was to a whole world of people joining the workforce now, where the only door is to their own kitchen in terms of working. But is there any connection there that I could ask you to elaborate on in terms of having information? Because there's historically been, work is work and life is life, and many people, I'm going to say, suffering in silence, or at least coping in silence. So what is the connection to having conversation or building rapport in order to be empathetic?
It's a multifaceted question. I think this is a natural shift of the generations, right? So generations coming up have a very different view on work and its place in their life. And although the pendulum is certainly swinging, I'm a fan of it. Personally, I do think work should be a part of the system. And we as leaders and those kind of in the organization are, of course, expecting people when they show up to work, they show up with their whole selves. And I think that starts with the leaders. And so in order for people to feel comfortable, I guess, with the open door policy, or just showing up as their whole self, the leaders have to show up that way. And that's been shifting too. So like we talked about before, I've worked in different countries with very different cultures. So Canada to Germany to the US. And this is one thing that varies very differently between cultures, how you show up as your true self. Is it just corporate? Or I've had the pleasure of working for, again, two amazing female leaders who, for the first time in my career, saw someone show up as them, good, bad, ugly, sense of humor, crass. And all of a sudden it changed something with everyone around them was more open to being themselves and sharing. And that's how you build the trust, the rapport, the empathy. And it permeates. It's such a beautiful culture permeation. But it started in that case from the very top.
I'm delighted you've had that experience in your career. And we had a brief chat before recording. I'm a big proponent for women taking over at least part of the world, if not a lot of the world moving forward. I keep having that opinion reinforced in conversation of late. So I want to talk about this starting with the leader and showing up with your whole self, because I can tell you that in my career span and the vintage that I bring, that there was no concept, there was no language, there was no oxygen provided to me having a whole self at work. It did not exist. And certainly with working in and around soft skills and around communications, I had a preview, I believe, before many, just because I do get to sample and have for so long different industries and different levels of authority. So this introduction of a concept of a whole self is still a bit sparkly and new and under some, well, hopefully assessment in terms of what that actually means. And if you tie what a whole self or whole person approach is to work with, starting with leaders, I get some big bells and whistles going off in my head about the potential for social risk. Mm-hmm. Social risk in a framework where that leader perhaps is not fulfilling what has historically, or even in a more immediate cultural set of norms as to what a credible, authority, inspiring leader may or may not look like. Is there a conversation, or is there acknowledgement around that social risk in your experience with these leaders?
It's a great question. I haven't seen the negative side of it, to be truthful. I've seen much more benefits than anything detrimental in this. So if you were weighing whether it's worth it or not, I would still say absolutely yes. And it doesn't come without boundaries, right? And so I think any leader, any individual, life or professional, you set your own boundaries, and that certainly applies within an organization and within the hierarchy of the organization. And so that doesn't necessarily go away, but I think it's the openness to the idea that for people to be most successful, to enjoy their job, to love their company, they have to generally like what they're doing and who they're working with. And to like who you're working with, you have to know who you're working with, which also requires them to know you as a leader. Like there has to be the reciprocity there. And I've seen more benefits to kind of letting those walls down a bit than anything else.
Yeah. There's what I would say to you, an extreme that I have encountered usually with groups that I work with within organizations that I get to visit perhaps on an annual basis or over time. So there can be a great perspective that I'm privileged to have. And I can tell you that perhaps going back to our pre-COVID and COVID question with a couple of toes in that pool for a moment, that it was not unusual for me 10 years ago to come across a person every once in a while to volunteer out of nowhere, because I assure you, I would not solicit this kind of information, who would give me a calculation. And it would be something like, I've only got 16,411 days until I can retire. Or I've only got 8 years, 2 months, and a week. And I can tell you that my instinctual response every single time I've heard any of those calculations is, oh, I don't even have language. I shudder. I literally shudder inside. And yet I have learned that I'm being told this information because it's a great celebration oftentimes of what it is that motivates that person. And they are elated with the number and they are counting it down. To me, the shudder is in part because it sounds like a prison sentence to my ears. But I know that that's the bias that I bring. And I have to say that sort of faded. And just in this last 18 months or so, I've had a resurrection amongst some of the members of a few groups who have literally started to say things like, yeah, I've only got 1,247 days and then I'm out of here. And while it's not age specific, I will say to you that most, to my experience with a broad brushstroke of generalization, start to think about retiring, within certain frameworks or when there's certain activities that are in alignment. It's not a particular point in anyone's life necessarily. But if you are looking to retirement or not working, whatever, or working somewhere else, I can't help but think that there's an opportunity that you're not actually leveraging that whole person approach, or that you're not having as much either satisfaction or support now versus what you find motivating over yonder.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've heard anyone say comments like that or what your thoughts are.
And I think it varies based on a lot of things. I mean, it varies based on like demographic and how long you've been working, how close to retirement you are. I mean, I don't want to discourage that. It's an amazing thing to potentially get to that place where you don't have to work anymore. But in the here and now, is everyone at a job that they love? And so for myself, as an example, do I love every second of every day? No, it's very stressful at times. But does my job and my role in my company bring out the best in me? Absolutely. And so in that way, it's symbiotic a little bit, right? So like I add value to the company, it adds value to myself. But part of that responsibility is on the individual. I have had to change roles, change companies to find that fit that brought that out in me. And it will evolve over time, and that's okay. But I think individuals need to remember that they have choice. I don't want to minimize it. It's not always easy to jump ship. There's a lot of factors in everyone's life, but there is the element of choice, right? So if you're unhappy in your day to day, move on. To start taking the steps to move on. And I think once you work for a company, and I've worked for a few divisions now where like the culture is just amazing, you'll never go back. It resets where your bar is and you'll never go back. And I just wish more people could find that.
I agree with you. And perhaps at times there is a limited sense of scope in terms of the possibilities. And again, because of the nature of my work, I can assure you, I visit cultures where people are delighted and others not so much.
Mhm.
And it's certainly an individual choice, as you suggested. This is not a judgment on my part whatsoever, but it isn't a single choice. It needs to be part of what we bring, perhaps on the regular, to ensure that we are that whole person, and that whole person is potentially having enough rapport so that there can be empathy, because there's some real thinking that makes sense that if you are not offering enough of yourself, it can be very difficult for others to understand how to be of support and how to set you up for success, or what success looks like for you versus the business. And of course, productivity and certain benchmarks that are non-negotiable, but the human factor, let's figure that out, right? Let's figure that out. And that's a great segue in terms of our next question, because you selected one around feedback. And the question is, how do you provide feedback? And we're giving you options around either at a peer level, or certainly looking upwards, or towards your staff and the org chart. But let's talk about feedback.
Mm-hmm. I think, again, this starts with the feedback giver, I think. So the feedback giver, no matter where you are in the organization, you spend years, decades building your reputation. How do you show up? How do you interact with others? And I think in order to give feedback in a way that it's best serving everyone, you need to have that reputation and ability to be direct. It's not about brutal honesty. I hope that term goes away permanently. It is about honesty and directness. And again, an element of trust that I am looking out for you and I'm looking out for the organization. And that is why I'm providing this feedback, right? It's not, it has to serve a greater purpose. And it's not easy by any means. And it's not easy to receive, depending if the feedback is positive or negative, obviously. But if there is an element of respect there, I think that goes a long way. And the feedback giver has to take a lot of onus on how they are giving that feedback. It isn't enough to just say, "Oh, I'm direct, I'm honest, I'm brutally honest." No, you have to take responsibility for how that's going to be received if you truly want the most beneficial outcome across the board.
Absolutely. So from a training perspective, I'm often asking people to recognize the difference between expected and unexpected feedback. And then to sort of fulfill that matrix, we have the critical versus positive. So if it's unexpected and critical, the recipient of that feedback is necessarily going to suggest that there might be some sort of question of one's social standing and or of one's overall input and or value, because it is literally out of left field, unexpected and critical. The giver, as you suggested, has an enormous responsibility, because if feedback is whimsical, for lack of a more descriptive term, and if it certainly is using antiquated language like brutal honesty, then it is going to be that much more of an uphill battle for any actionable items or mutual understanding to be the result. In your own work, how have you brought feedback into, I want to say, a standard or normalized or acceptable framework?
I think this follows just a general trend over the past many years. It's just the frequency, right? So it's no longer the once a year or twice a year feedback sessions. It needs to be frequent. And it needs to be two-sided. So your leaders need to be asking for feedback and receiving it. And individuals need to feel comfortable sharing that for there to be some reciprocity there. I think that is critical. So we've done that in a few kind of, I would say, micro ways, but soliciting kind of questions or comments at our town halls anonymously. They are very difficult questions requiring very difficult answers, but like it's getting to the root of our organization. And that to the leadership is feedback, right? What are the people wondering and not understanding or criticizing of leadership? That's okay. But how we react to that has to be in line with how we expect employees to react. I think the other is when you're approaching feedback and, like you said, like critical and unexpected, you need to come prepared as the feedback giver on what are the next steps. You can't just leave it hanging. You're not great at this, and then so what? What are the next steps? How do you build them back into where they're kind of expected to be, or what are some options for them? They need to understand the outcome, whether it's a social outcome or where do they stand. It's very uncomfortable otherwise. So I think that's important.
Absolutely. And one of the turns of phrase that really I use a lot and really believe in is that feedback is actually feeding forward. And when you mention action steps, it's the under-sophisticated provider or giver of the feedback that can get distracted, in my opinion, and stay in the past around some corrective or even looking for motivational explanations. And I often ask people to recognize that the why behind why something may or may not have been as expected or may not have had the results, or the why is often not what's going to help us figure out what to do next.
Yep.
And that what means that you're right. There needs to be even a few nanoseconds of planning, because as the provider, or usually the person with more authority or the leader who's giving the feedback, if we let it hang and want there to be some sort of inspiration from the recipient, who in that moment could feel quite distracted by a fight or flight experience because there's feedback coming their way, and they may feel that they've jeopardized their livelihood or that their reputation is at stake, or all of the potential for catastrophizing that some of us can go down very, very quickly. That forward, or what do we do from here approach, I honestly believe that provides solace and the, if not foundation, it's an example of some of the psychological safety for there to be the reciprocity that you mentioned. Because it didn't happen. Okay. Really would have liked it to have happened. Okay. We had that figured out. We didn't. Okay. Take a beat. And even then, the giver, as you mentioned a few times, there's a role modeling here. There's a piece of self-awareness as a leader that I hear thematically in some of your responses in our time together. Because in order for me to role model a behavior or to demonstrate, that self-awareness needs to be pretty well practiced, because let's face it, the giver is also human and potentially has been, well, the person who had to speak to X not having been successful, or having to take on a different level of responsibility or be the public face of what may or may not have happened, which that leads to some high emotions as well, right? So I'm very much encouraged by that role modeling that you've spoken about a few times, and I have to say I would like to hear more leaders speak about that. Um, so as a final question, or as a follow-up, let me say, have you thought about the self-awareness that a leader needs to be a role model? Is that within your frame of reference?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm it's something that I think everyone needs, is a level of self-awareness. I think it comes naturally to some people more than others. Um, and it can also go too far, so to speak, where like you're hypercritical of everything you do. So there is a nice boundary there. Um, but yeah, I think a level of self-awareness is not just taking your own inventory of who you are, what you care about, how you react, what you would do differently. I think it is important to take your own self-inventory, but also to bounce things off of someone you really trust. So it can be in the workplace something as simple as having a trusted colleague in a similar meeting give you feedback. And not just feedback in this case on like how you presented or how was the topic, but how did you come across? How did you engage with other people? Like someone you really trust who can get into the soft skills, the interpersonal skills. That's where people can start to fine tune their ability to really be dynamic in an organization, right? You cannot turn your brain off to the social dynamics. If you can tune into it, it requires a lot of self-awareness, but hugely advantageous.
Absolutely. And the self-awareness that you emphasize there needs data. Mm-hmm. And the data there is, you're absolutely right, a self-inventory, which is not a one-time shot. For some, on a continuous basis, for others on the regular. But we need also the data of specific or targeted feedback. And I think in fact, I know that's where some of us as leaders in particular tend to fall down, because asking for, does anyone have feedback while you have checked the box is one, a bit intimidating at times, because how do I respond to that? And two, it generally will fall into where there isn't much opportunity for adding your perspective to that self-awareness, self-inventory. So targeted, as you suggested, and from a trusted source. I wish I could remember the author. There's an author who speaks of the importance of finding what's called loving critics.
Oh yeah, that's the exact idea.
Yeah, and of a loving critic is well-intentioned. There's no need for us to clarify that we're all in this together. However, you've asked me to look at and to assess for you how it is that you are engaging others when we have our town hall. So I am focused on giving you that very particular feedback. And if you do have a loving critic, there's much more of that hurdle of intention, or there being some sort of, potential for malice that's no longer taking up any of the oxygen. So I wish I could remember the author. I'm sure it will come to me once we no longer are recording. So I'll make a note with the podcast. In terms of inventory, though, I do want to say a sincere thank you for your choice of questions and the inventory that we were able to cover off in terms of topics in this episode. A pleasure to hear your perspective. Thank you again, Renée.
Thank you. It's been awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for listening to another dynamic and informative episode of the Soft Skills Salon with your host, Diana Kowarski. Please consider subscribing to our show wherever you listen to your podcasts, and we also encourage you to visit our website and social media links, which you can find in the show's notes. We look forward to bringing you another episode, and remember, conversation is the currency of communication. Bye for now.